which was so often quoted and cited. So it appeared, it influenced the language, the Christian language as a whole. There may have been several factors that encouraged this revival of group Moechus. First, there was the need to describe new concept, namely husband's adultery. Adulter was not suitable for this use because it has been used for centuries in Latin language and its meaning was already firmly established. But terms gathered around Moechus, which we have said almost disappeared from Latin literature in late antiquity, in later Latin literature, were more easily subject to this semantic change. Secondly, there was paronymia with Moechus. We know that for centuries, Christian Latinity in the West developed predominantly in a spoken form and within predominantly Greek communities. And in those communities, Moechus, which is a Latinized form of Moechus, may have been preferred to adulter. Also, translators may have believed that by using Moechus, they will more faithfully convey the content of Greek term Moechus, which is the main term for adultery in New Testament. Third is the question of identity. Moechus evoked Greek language and thus New Testament texts. And by using it, Christian fathers manifested their belonging to Christian community. So by using this new vocabulary, new words, with new meanings, Christian fathers emphasized that new Christian law is now in force and that this law replaced the former Roman law, and in case of family law, that was the law of Augustus that sanctioned this double standard in adultery. So where does the text of the Old Testament stand, having in mind everything that we have said? When translating Hebrew terms for adultery, Jerome uses names from the group adulter, but the verb moechai. So he uses adulter, adultera, adulterium, but when it comes to verb, he chooses moechai. So we see that he is completely in line with everything that we have said. In Vulgate, and this goes for Old Testament and New Testament books as well, we only find two terms from this group. And it is mostly moechai and only once Moechus in Pentateuch. In Old Testament, verbs for adultery appear only in that patriarchal manner, so they only signify the adultery of a married woman and acts of her lover. But that was not the choice of Jerome, it was imposed to him by the content of the Old Testament texts. For Hebrews, as almost all ancient nations, only condemned and sanctioned female adultery. So there is no mention of husband's adultery in old texts, and thus such use. Any discrepancies in translation were due to the need for clarity or to the need to preserve the vocabulary of older Latin translations. On several occasions, and that is 1/4 of occasions, Jerome uses words from the group adulter to translate more general Hebrew terms, such as man, woman, or sin. And he does so to be more specific, so to make things more clear. He never uses Moechus in that manner. Moechus appears only as a translation of Hebrew nav, which is the main group of terms for adultery. So whenever he chooses, Jerome chooses adulter. But he uses moechai, and one of the main causes he may do so was, of course, the respect to existing Latin biblical translations. With Christian Latin, neologisms appear. mostly abstract words meaning adultery. Those neologisms are typical for Victus Latina, and they never appear neither in Old, neither in New Testament. However, neither in Old, neither in New Testament, we don't find the word Moechus. So we may conclude that this word was offensive in Jerome times, that it still had some negative connotations. We don't find neologisms, neither Moechus, in other Jerome's work either. So we may suppose that Jerome had cleaned them from the Vulgate. In other Jerome's works, we predominantly find the same forms as in Vulgate. Discrepancies are rare, and when it happens, it goes only to the alternative use of Moechus and Adultery. Jerome rarely innovates with vocabulary. When he does so, he rather innovates with syntax and grammar. The reason for that is that biblical text is considered sacred, and such is the translation. So once formed, vocabulary of biblical translations was preserved and was not supposed to be changed without any valid reason, because it may lead to corruption and misinterpretation. So our study has showed that new Christian sexual ethics indeed reflected on Latin language that can be traced in Old Testament texts, but in other export corpora as well. And it showed us that those corpora can be divided into three distinct wholes. First, non-classical Latin, which had no major similarities with any other corpora. Then Jerome's vocabulary, including Old Testament books and other works, which show greatest similarities with Christian literature in general. And at the end, the vocabulary of the New Testament, which presents a radical lexical pole of Christian Latinity, mostly due to the Greek and spoken Latin influence. So that would be all. Thank you. Hello everybody. I'm really happy to be here with you and to share with you some of the results of my PhD study. Today we're focusing on the terms for adultery in the Vulgate, but also in other corpora. I know you're now expecting something really interesting and intriguing, but I will bore you to death with hardcore linguistics. Role of the family has changed through society, and with this changed role, also attitudes towards marriage changed. However, adultery was always through history considered a serious threat to marriage and thus to family and to the society as a whole. Still, in ancient times, in antiquity, patriarchal view of adultery prevailed, meaning that only married woman was supposed to be faithful, while husband was not expected to do so. Christianity brought new sexual ethics, requesting equal standards for both sexes. And now, this view of adultery that in Roman times was sanctioned by Augustus' law of family started to change. What we were trying to explore here is first how and whether these changed cultural attitudes have reflected on Latin language, in which manner and in which extent, and to do so we have focused on the selected passages of the Vulgate. So why Vulgate? As we all know, at the instigation of Pope DANUBIUS, Jerome first revised the existing Latin translation of New Testament books, and then he translated from Hebrew books of the Old Testament. This version soon became the most common and the most authoritative version of the Bible in the Latin West. And Bible being the book of the books, Vulgate has influenced deeply European literature and Romance languages, their content, their style, and their vocabulary. Text translation of the Vulgate was formed in a moment that was crucial for the development of the Christian sexual and marriage morality. Today, Western marriage morals that has its roots in Christian sexual ethics is facing serious challenges. We can see that the need for exclusivity in sexual relations and in marriage is being more and more questioned. So we believed that by exploring terminology of adultery at the very roots of this Western marriage morality may bring some additional knowledge, put some additional light to the question of marriage, and may help us position the marriage in this world that is rapidly changing in front of our eyes. So we have explored terms that describe adultery in the Vulgate, and we have compared their use in several corpora. It was a huge research I did for 10 years. So we have explored non-Christian Latin, Christian Latin, text of the Vulgate, and Vetus Latina, which comprises all the Latin translations prior and contemporary to Jerome's, then all the citations, quotations, and also all the references to, for us, relevant biblical verses in the works of the Christian fathers. As far as the time span is concerned, we have explored Latin literature from its very beginnings until the 6th century, comprising the works of Pope Gregory the Great, because then Lombards' invasion of Italy ended all the legacy of Justinian's Reconquista, and Latin language in Italy rapidly vulgarized towards Italian. So, Latin language has two sets of terms for adultery. First of them is based on the term adulter, and the second one is based on the term moechus. We will, for this presentation, to make things easier, only speak about adulter and moechus, but this asterisk in front of the word will show to you that we're in fact speaking about the entire group that is built around these terms. Those two sets of terms were partial synonyms. They shared the same meaning, but they did not have the same connotations. Adulter was a proper word for adultery of Latin origin, and it was a neutral legal term, so it was appropriate for high style, for prose, for legal texts. On the other hand, moechus is a Latinized version of Greek term for adulterer, or for adulterer, moichos. From Greek language, it entered spoken Latin, and from spoken Latin, Latin literature through comedy. And this historical path has determined its further use. It was used as a mocking and potentially offensive term. It was appropriate for low style, for poetry, and for comedy, mime, epigram, and satire. That reflected on their frequency. As a proper word for adultery, adulter appears 11 times more often than moechus in classical Latin. In later Latin, adulter became characteristic for educated Latin, while moechus virtually disappears from Latin literature, but was preserved in a spoken form, and that we will see from its revival in Christian Latinity. That patriarchal view of adultery as something that could be done only by a married woman and her lover reflected on language. So terms for adultery in Latin language only denote an unfaithful woman and her lover or her seducer, and not unfaithful husband. Namely, adultera and moicha signify unfaithful wife, but adulter and moechus do not point to unfaithful husband, but rather describe the lover of a married woman. Adulterare Moechari, and Adulterium do not only point to the acts of unfaithful woman and her lover. So Latin had no word for unfaithful husband or his actions. And this lexical disproportion reflected double standards that prevailed in Roman society. Christian sexual ethics brought something genuinely new, and that is the request for husband to be faithful as well. Now, with Christian Latin, terms for adultery begin denoting husband's adultery as well. And this use begins with New Testament, namely with Gospels and with verses where Jesus condemns divorce and describes second marriage, of course while the first spouse is still living, as an adultery. These verses were of huge importance for the development of Christian marriage and sexual ethics. And in the use of terms for adultery in them paved the way to further use of the Latin terms in this new meaning. Second characteristic of Christian Latinity was revival of the group Moechus. Those terms appear much more often in Christian Latin than in classical Latin. Of course, first, that is due to a larger corpus of texts, but adulter appears 5 more times more often than in classical Latinity, while adulter appears only twice more often. This high frequency is typical mostly for New Testament texts, but also for all the books of the Vulgata. Adulter is still more frequent, but the ratio changes from 11:1 in classical Latinity to 5:1 in Christian Latin texts, 4:1 in Old Testament, and 1.6:1 in New Testament. This high frequency in New Testament shows that it was Christianity that gave key impetus to the revival of this group. Moreover, Moechus and adulter now have the same tone. Moechus is no more an offensive term, so they are being used alternatively as true synonyms. We see that, according to this frequency, vocabulary of the Old Testament is closer to Christian Latinity in general than to New Testament texts, which may also imply that Jerome's interventions in New Testament were not extensive, because the ratio differs. Third characteristic is higher proportion of verbs, and particularly of the verb moechari. Names from each of those two lexical groups in classical Latin appear much more frequently than verbs. So adulter appears 66 times, names from this group appear 66 times more often than verb adulterare in classical Latin. But this ratio changes to 11:3, and in New Testament books we see that adulterare is now used even more often than names from this group. The same goes for moechari, but with moechari the change is even more obvious, because verb is less common only in classical Latin, while in all Christian texts, but particularly in Vulgate and particularly in New Testament, moechari appears much more often than names from this group. Especially typical is the use of moechari and its comparison with the verb adulterare. Even though terms from the group adulter still appear more often, more times, than words from the group moechus, moechari, on the other hand, appears more often, more times than adulterare. One of the explanations for this could be the fact that moechari appeared in the Bible and in many important texts and verses for the development of the sexual ethics. For example, non-Wahhabists